As it became clear the Israeli occupation forces had failed in their mission inside the Gaza Strip and that the occupation leaders failed to find a domestic path for a settlement that would alleviate the security burdens placed on those forces, even the mere thought of launching a war against Hezbollah in the north is tantamount to real suicide. With the ongoing clashes between the Lebanese Islamic Resistance Hezbollah and the enemy on the southern border, a political development emerged from within the entity late last week. Zionist Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his War Minister Yoav Gallant announced their desire to reach an agreement with Lebanon, while Beirut witnessed an important meeting between Hezbollah Secretary General Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah and the Secretary General of the Islamic group Jama'ah Islamiyah Sheikh Mohammed Taqoush. This meeting was dedicated to discussing coordination between the two parties based on their involvement in the support front for the resistance in Gaza. In the meantime, another day passes with the sirens not ceasing to go off in the settlements, sites, and Israeli occupation military bases because of Hezbollah's missiles and drones, while an interesting statement was made by War Minister Yoav Gallant during his visit to an Iron Dome system base near Lebanon. He said, "We are preparing the political alternative, which is always the best. We do not seek war, but we are ready for it. I hope we reach a settlement." Now, Tel Aviv wants the Lebanese resistance rockets to stop and for the complaints from the Zionists affected by those projectiles reaching Kiryat Shmona and other places to stop too. The solution is pretty simple. Zionist Israel should stop the aggression against the Gaza Strip, rather than igniting more fires that will consume Zionist Israelis and no one else. For the first day of its operations, Hezbollah has stipulated that the Israeli entity genocidal war machine must stop claiming more lives in the Gaza Strip for the rockets launched from South Lebanon towards Israeli occupation settlements and military sites to cease. This is a humane, rational, and clear condition. But the extremist mentality that governs Zionist Israel today is determined to be stubborn and expand the scope of the war. Just like Zionist extremist minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who keeps calling for a military offensive. In response to Gallant's wish for a political settlement, Ben-Gvir had replied, "How is that possible without war, and how do we end the situation well? Haven't we learned a lesson from 20 years of settlements? We will make the necessary settlements, and after a year or two, they will rape our wives and kill our children." Ben-Gvir here was projecting again the vile Zionist actions against Palestinians. By now, we all have seen firsthand how every Zionist Israeli accusation is an actual confession. Confessions of rape, decapitating Palestinian babies, and burning down refugee camps. Confessions of bombing schools, hospitals, and humanitarian institutions, offering much-needed help for people facing genocide. Confessions that are enough to make Hezbollah rain guided missiles and bomber drones on the vile Zionist entity till the end of time. Welcome to the Middle East Stream. I'm Marwa Osman. Without downplaying the importance of the roles played by all parties in the axis of resistance in providing military support and assistance to Palestinian resistance currently defending Gaza in a genocidal war by Zionist Israel, it can be said that the role of Hezbollah in particular was decisive in determining the course of the conflict in this particular round. But what is the prospect of an all-out war between Hezbollah and the Zionist occupation army? To discuss this issue with us from Damascus is Vanessa Beeley, independent journalist and geopolitical commentator. It's a pleasure having you on board, Vanessa, this morning. So far, it does not appear that the Tel Aviv regime, otherwise known as occupied Jaffa regime, has actual plans on how to escape this predicament of their genocidal war in Gaza, other than spilling just more blood of civilians. It is certain that this bloody path will not lead to any sort of victory for the Zionist entity. So taking that into consideration, on what grounds are the Zionists pushing for a war of attrition against Lebanon when they so far were not able to contain a confined space like Gaza over the past 9 months?
Effectively, this is a lose-lose situation for the Zionist entity. As you rightly say, it has not achieved its objectives in Gaza, despite, of course, the slaughter of Gazan civilians, women, children in the majority. If Israel is really crazy enough to expand the war into Lebanese territory or to bomb civilian infrastructure deeper inside Lebanon, it will face the same reaction from Hezbollah and a parallel attack and infiltration of Zionist territory, of the occupied territories by Hezbollah. The resistance has had years of building up resilience against the Zionist entity with constant incursions, attacks, and onslaughts against its territory. While in reality, the occupied territories have rarely faced all-out war inside the occupied territories, and therefore the Israeli people, the Israeli military, have none of the resilience that the resistance forces have built up. And this will be their most important vulnerability in any war that they expand into Lebanon.
Mm-hmm. How do you think the situation will look like inside of occupied Palestine for the Israeli entity settlers in the event of an all-out war?
Oh, I mean, it will be absolute devastation for them. We're already hearing that they will not have electricity. They won't be able to run the generators because they won't have the fuel to do so, and the factories will stop working. We've seen a microcosm of this situation in the northern occupied territories with more than 200,000 settlers, businesses, economies forced to flee the area and unable to return. And this will be the situation across Israel. We will also see probably a mass exodus of the unlawful settlers from the Zionist entity, fleeing from the bombardment. Mm-hmm. And Israel depends upon its settlers to survive. So, as I said, this is a lose-lose war for mm-hmm. Israel.
But Vanessa, people in the West cannot really visualize what it means for Zionist Israel to announce open war against Lebanon, against Hezbollah in specific. Could you help explain it from each possible front that might open in the event of an all-out war with Lebanon?
Well, we've seen recent warnings by the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Sayed Nasrallah, to Cyprus to not allow its air bases to be used as a launch pad against Lebanon should the war escalate. Of course, we know that the UK and the US have already been using what are effectively sovereign British bases on the island of Cyprus to ferry weapons and troops into Lebanon and to Israel. Therefore, people need to understand that were the Zionist entity to really escalate this war against Lebanon, not only would that expand the war, in my opinion, to, for example, the British bases on Cyprus if they are effectively being used to target Lebanon, but it could potentially bring in the NATO member states that have already implanted troops into northern Lebanon under the pretext of evacuating citizens should a war escalate between Hezbollah and the Zionist entity. But not only that, the resistance factions in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, across the region have made it very clear that if Lebanon is attacked, then they will enter the war. And that, of course, includes Iran, who has made it very clear that if Lebanon is targeted, then Iran will prevent any escalation by the Zionist entity. And that may well bring it, of course, into direct confrontation with NATO member states, with the US, the UK, and the EU. So, this is no longer a contained war in this instance. This becomes a global war, and that's what people need to be very aware of.
Mm-hmm. Well, Netanyahu is using the power of the so-called Christian Zionists in the United States of America, lobbying in Congress to try and intensify the genocidal operations that he's doing against the people of Gaza, and he's pushing also towards declaring war on Lebanon and even attacking Iran at some point, with support obviously from the United States of America and its allies. Are we nearing here the end of Netanyahu's political era as he knows it? Because a lot of media, especially Western media that was once supportive of this genocide, is now maybe laying the ground for someone else to take over other than Netanyahu.
I think, to be honest, for me, this is a lot of political doublespeak that's going on. Netanyahu has basically effectively been a puppet of the West in Israel for more than 3 decades. And despite his sociopathic nature, he is still doing the bidding of the US and the UK. If Netanyahu's political career were to be ended, then of course he also faces charges of corruption and faces prosecution. So he will hang on to power as long as he possibly can. But I think much of what we see, for example, the presumed support for Yoav Gallant in preference to Netanyahu, the contradiction in the statements being put out by members of Netanyahu's administration. However, I think we always have to keep our eye on the direction of travel and to understand that the final solution, which is, of course, the full ethnic cleansing of Palestine, is still the aim of the Netanyahu administration, regardless of whether Netanyahu is in power or not, and those that keep Israel on life support, which are effectively the US, the UK, and members of the EU and some of the Gulf states.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was Vanessa Beeley, independent journalist and geopolitical commentator from Damascus, talking to us about a possible all-out war between Lebanon and the Zionist entity. I want to thank you very much, Vanessa, for being with us and giving us your insights. Ladies and gents, please stay tuned, because next we're talking about the debate that happened between Trump and Biden and what that has to do with Palestine. Stay tuned. In the contentious debate between former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden regarding Palestine, contrasting visions and policies emerged that underscored deep-seated divisions in American foreign policy. Now, the debate illuminated how different leadership styles and priorities shape America's role in the Zionist-Israeli-Palestinian war, as Biden is complicit in genocide and Trump thinks Biden did not do enough to help Zionist Israel kill more Palestinians. More details in the following report. Much of the attention on last week's presidential debate fell upon President Joe Biden's faltering performance, which has called into question whether he can even remain the Democratic candidate. In the aftermath, some have focused on former President Donald Trump's non-stop lies. Left largely overlooked, however, has been the open xenophobia Trump deployed against Palestinians and immigrants and the silence with which it was met. The most striking illustration might be Trump's response to a prompt from CNN moderator Dana Bash regarding Zionist Israel's war in Gaza and the humanitarian crisis that the Israeli regime has created while killing thousands of Palestinians. As Biden insisted that Hamas was the only entity standing in the way of a ceasefire, Trump actually pushed back on the idea.
You got to ask him, as far as Israel and Hamas, Israel's the one that wants to go. He said the only one that wants to keep going is Hamas. Actually, Israel is the one, and you should let him go and let him finish the job. He doesn't want to do it. He's become like a Palestinian, but they don't like him because he's a very bad Palestinian. He's a weak one.
Now, instead of pushing back or even acknowledging the absurdity of Trump's answers, the moderators would simply move on, thanking the twice-impeached former president for his time. When, for instance, Trump accused Biden of having become like a Palestinian, but a very bad one, a weak one, the moderators did not ask him what that meant or why the word Palestinian is apparently a pejorative. Nor did they question what finish the job might mean in the context of a war that has killed upwards of 37,000 civilians. Biden, for his part, began his retort saying he's never heard so much foolishness, but did nothing to refute Trump's claims, instead focusing on Trump wanting to leave NATO. In response to the same question, Biden said he's still pushing hard for Hamas to accept a ceasefire. And then he made his statement clear.
The only thing I've denied Israel was 2,000-pound bombs. They don't work very well in populated areas. They kill a lot of innocent people. We're providing Israel with all the weapons they need and when they need them.
We are the biggest producer of support for Israel than anyone in the world, Biden said. While many fear the Democratic Party brass is rerunning elements of 2016, refusing to take seriously those who fear their stubbornness may lead to Trump's victory, it seems the media is following suit in treating Trump's viciousness as a baseline rather than an aberration. Now to discuss this issue with us from Beirut is Mr. Hamza Khansajeh, political analyst and journalist at the Lebanese daily Al Akhbar. It's a pleasure having you with us, Mr. Hamza. Now, Donald Trump has called U.S. President Joe Biden a very bad Palestinian who doesn't want to help Israel finish the job against Hamas in its war on Gaza. I'm quoting Trump here. What is a good Palestinian here, Mr. Hamza, according to Trump, and how do you expect the deal with the current genocide in Palestine will be from the Trump administration if he were to become president again, God forbid?
بالبداية تحياتي لحضرتك ولجميع المشاهدين. يعني اليوم
First of all, greetings to you and all the viewers. Today, we no longer know what a good Palestinian is, according to the American administration. Because according to Trump's remarks in the last debate, he set a standard for a good Palestinian as one who is acceptable to the Israelis. We know that even President Mahmoud Abbas does not and will not gain the approval of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Zionist Israelis in general, who reject the two-state solution as a settlement for the ongoing conflict or war today. So, the good Palestinian for everyone, for the Zionist Israelis and the Americans, is the one who is subjected to destruction and massacres, whose family the Netanyahu government is ready to wipe out, whether in the West Bank, which is the second on the list of Zionist aggression, or in Gaza, which has been subjected to a genocide war for the past 9 months.
القضاء على آخر فلسطين كان في الضفة اللي هي على اللائحة التالي للعمليات العدوانية يعني والمخططات وإن كان غزة التي تتعرض منذ 9 أشهر.
Today, for any American administration, there is a real dilemma regarding the day after the war on Gaza, because Benjamin Netanyahu rejects all the initiatives, even those directly presented by President Joe Biden and presented as Zionist Israeli initiatives, but Netanyahu rejects them. At the top of this constant Zionist Israeli rejection within Netanyahu's government is the issue of the two-state solution as the starting point for the new phase, after discussing the day after the war with Hamas. Especially since the American administration linked the issue of normalization and Saudi Arabia's public entry into normalization, which is one of the Saudi demands, linked all this to the two-state solution and giving the Palestinians a state regardless of its specifications, authorities, and capabilities, but merely as ink on paper. And even this ink is rejected by the Israeli regime. This puts the American administration, regardless of whether it is Biden or Trump, in a real dilemma.
حبر على ورق حتى هذا يرفضه الإسرائيليون وهذا يضع الإدارة الأمريكية بغض النظر عن بايدن أو ترامب في معضلة حقيقية.
Well, meanwhile, we did hear Biden falsely claim that every party concerned with the ceasefire except Hamas has agreed to his ceasefire proposal and that he had secured an across-the-board agreement for a three-stage plan to end the war, including from the Israeli entity regime. We never heard anything coming from the Israeli entity regime, but this is what Biden said. What is he really talking about here?
يعني هذه أيضا واحدة من الكذبات التي يروج لها الإدارة الأمريكية.
This is also one of the lies propagated by the American administration, which reflects the confusion that characterizes American diplomatic moves concerning the genocide being waged by the Israeli occupation entity on the Gaza Strip. The main reason for this is Benjamin Netanyahu's challenge to the American administration by rejecting all the solutions proposed by America.
نتنياهو لبايدن على أبواب الانتخابات وهو يعرف أن هذا يؤثر في شعبيته وبالفعل أثر في شعبية بايدن وخسر.
This is also related to Netanyahu's fight against Biden on the eve of the American elections, knowing that this will affect his popularity, which it has indeed affected, as he has lost many points in recent opinion polls. But the most obvious lie is that the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, came out 2 days after Biden announced his New Deal to promote this idea as an actual Israeli entity proposal. It is known that 2 days ago, the National Security Advisor to the U.S. Vice President pleaded with the Israeli entity government to accept the proposal that Biden is promoting as an Israeli entity proposal. Therefore, today all the attempts presented by the American administration are being thwarted by Benjamin Netanyahu, because he has set himself high ceilings that he cannot overcome, which are the complete elimination of Hamas and the rejection of the two-state solution. Therefore, as an Israeli entity government, he has not yet put forward a plan for the day after the end of the war. This also relates to Netanyahu's obstinacy against Biden, specifically on the eve of the elections, because he is betting on Donald Trump's success in the upcoming election.
التعنت نتنياهو في وجه بايدن بالتحديد على أبواب الانتخابات لأنه يراهن على قدوم دونالد ترامب في الانتخابات المقبلة.
Well, the debate also highlighted how both the Democrats and the Republicans have lost their will to end the war and to support the creation of an independent Palestinian state. Of course, there's no prospect so far as well for how things will look like in the day after, as you just said, the day after the war on Gaza. But let us talk about the real viable options that are left for the American administration, the current American administration, to at least implement it on the ground and not just keep it pen on a paper.
يعني نحن لنكن واضحين كل إلى الآن.
Let's be clear, up to now, if we agree that all the moves made by the American administration have failed diplomatically, the issue of establishing a foothold in Gaza through the floating port is facing many difficulties. Today, there are even speculations that this idea might be cancelled or abandoned. Within the soft pressure plan that the Biden administration is exerting on Netanyahu, there are no other options because all of them fall within the margin allowed for Netanyahu to maneuver.
بنيامين نتنياهو أي خيارات أخرى لأنه كلها من ضمن الهامش المسموح.
This includes rejecting proposals, prolonging the war, and going far against the declared wishes of the American administration. This indicates that those who set the high-level policies related to the Israeli occupation entity, its future in the region, and its role as a functional entity and an investment project for the West in our region are not the American administration, such as the White House or the ruling team with the president, regardless of whether they are Democrats or Republicans.
كإدارة كبيت الأبيض والفريق الحاكم مع الرئيس بغض النظر إن كان ديمقراطي أو جمهوري بل هي الدولة العميقة في الولايات المتحدة.
Instead, it is the deep state in the United States that considers the relationship with the Israeli occupation entity and the future of this relationship, support, armament, and other aspects as indicators of support to be higher than any traditional policies or relations between two governments. Therefore, if it were up to the American deep state to stop the war, and there was a major decision to stop the war, Benjamin Netanyahu, Gallant, or whoever is leading this war in Tel Aviv would simply stop it within minutes, and the opposite is also true.
بنت أو مهما من يكن في تل أبيب يقود هذه الحرب سيوقفها خلال دقائق معدودة والعكس هو صحيح.
I have one more minute with you, Mr. Hamza, and I want to ask you about the real look of that debate. We all saw how the world was reacting to the debate and how they were saying that it was ridiculous, it was unprofessional, it was disastrous. How do you think that will reflect on the American foreign policy towards West Asia? In a minute, please.
يعني هناك اليوم العديد من القراءات داخل
Today, there are many analyses within the United States that describe what happened in the first debate between Trump and Biden as a farce, and that it weakens the position of the United States in front of its adversaries and enemies, especially in the West Asia region, and in front of Iran, China, and Russia in general. It shows the fragility of the American system in producing leadership figures capable of leading the country during sensitive stages, while others, such as China, Russia, Iran, and the axis of resistance, are rising in economic, commercial, and military charts, and by imposing conditions and leverage in the region against the United States. This debate shows that there is a deep crisis within the United States in producing high-level political leaders capable of managing the global scene. This will help America's adversaries to compete with it in leading the world.
Well, I want to thank you very much from Beirut, Mr. Hamza Khansajeh, political analyst and journalist at the Lebanese daily Al Akhbar, for joining us to talk about this ridiculous debate that happened between Biden and Trump. It's always a pleasure having you on board, ladies and gents. Thank you very much for watching the Media Stream right here on Press TV. Do follow us on Telegram and on X, and we'll see you again next week. Assalamu alaikum.